We will go to Annalisa next.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks. That was really good discussion. So we have talked about food safety a few times in this great discussion today. So now we're going to kind of narrow it down just to that. So I will share a little bit about our program at University of Minnesota Extension, where we work with farmers on food safety. We also work with food hubs. We also work with schools. We also work with buyers, really anybody related to produce, to help them understand good agricultural practices, gap audits. Sarah told me that over the last few days, you all spoke about gap audits a little bit with some DATCAP folks as well from Wisconsin, a little bit about group gaps. So my presentation, I'm pretty quick. So I think that I can kind of get through this, and then I'm happy to answer any of those questions that I didn't get to. Just a little bit about University of Minnesota Extension food safety team. So like many other states, probably Extension has food safety in kind of the processing realm. I would say more kitchen, HACCP, cottage food, creating products safely. Then there's the farm food safety. So while they have similarities, they're also quite different. So our team focuses specifically on farm food safety. So those are those good agricultural practices that I'm sure you're all aware of. So I coordinate the team statewide. I'm based in like the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, but we are statewide. So my constituents are from, Minnesota's a big state. So the farthest northwest corner to the farthest southeast corner. And basically anyone who grows food for other people. So I kind of draw the line at homeowners, even though my supervisors would like me to create educational materials for backyard gardeners. One person is one person. So, but we do have a bit of a team approach that I can talk about as well. But there are so many needs, like David and Kazua had said. I mean, food safety is just one small aspect of growing, of course. So I'm a part of a horticultural team within Extension that actually, even though we're still pretty sparse compared to the need, it has really been built up compared to how it's been decimated in the past. So now we have a fruit specialist and we have a vegetable specialist, which for the whole state, again, is kind of paltry, but at least we do have people who are really similar to David, although they're able to do a lot less of that one-on-one because, again, the whole state is their audience. So I'm a part of that team. So we focus on those good agricultural practices through workshops, both online and in person, that technical assistance, which can be online, which can be in person, which can be email, phone call, texts at 10 p.m. as many of us probably get, trainings, so similar to the workshops, and field days. So field days are tough with summer and rain and everything, but I try to do a field day or two a season. Just to kind of highlight some good practices around food safety. And we, in the past, have combined workshops and field days. So we'll do a one-day or a half-day workshop on farm, and then the second part of that day have an exploratory sort of walking through the farm to identify the practices that we've learned about and really make it real. I review food safety plans. If a grower is looking, generally it's always because it's required. Although not always, but almost always, if a farmer has an actual written food safety plan, it's because they are required to do so by a buyer, and that's just fine. That's how that goes. So if a buyer, for example, Minneapolis Public Schools or the Good Acre, if they wanted it, or Big River Farms, if anybody said, hey, we've got a group of growers who is writing food safety plans, we will review them. But also if you could lay eyes on them, we would appreciate that. I will do that. And really answering questions about those food safety plans. A food safety plan is required for a gap audit. So if a farmer is going to get a gap audit, so Big River Farms has a gap audit. So that's quite a unique gap audit because they're kind of an aggregator, but also generally it would be just an individual farm would get that gap audit. So I help prepare growers for a gap audit. And generally that's helping develop that written food safety plan and those records. So a gap audit is really just a review of those records. So making sure that their records are going to suffice for that gap audit is part of my job, we don't have that many growers here with gap audits. So the vast majority of growers that I help, I really always kind of describe it as they're doing all of the practices. And then if they needed to get a gap audit for market access, it's not a law, but if they wanted to sell to a buyer who required that and it worked out financially for them, they can then flip that switch, get that gap audit because those systems are set up. But it can take years to set up those systems with growers. Depending on how motivated they are. If they've already got those systems, if they're kind of a systems thinking farm, if they're organically certified, it can be a lot less than those couple of years. And if they're motivated to basically to sell a lot of product to a market who requires that gap audit, they can get that. They can set up those systems within a season. Also, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, don't know if that's come up yet in this training, but that is now federal law around food safety. One component, one rule within the 7 rules of FSMA pertains to the growing, packing, and holding of fresh produce. So if you are covered by that rule, you are required to attend those trainings, and our team leads those trainings. And I will say, on the note talking about paying farmers to present, one of the key kind of cornerstones of our program too is that we pay farmers to present at almost all trainings, unless it's a smaller, somebody just wants me to speak for an hour about a specific topic or something to a group. Of course, I would maybe just go do that. But FSMA trainings, we pay our farmer trainers actually $1,000 a day to come and present with us. So pretty decent money, knowing that that takes lots of time to learn that rule. So that $1,000, I'm also assuming, is many of those hours are not spent on the actual day. It's an 8-hour training, but preparing for that day because it's regulatory. So we have to be very accurate with our language in those trainings. And we have a great group of, we have about 10 farmers that we pay to lead those FSMA trainings. And now these farmers are out there, kind of my eyes and ears, boots on the ground, able to do field days with me, able to lead GAPS trainings. And then we also help develop those record keeping systems, which in my mind absolutely are probably the hardest part. The GAP principles themselves, there are a couple things that sometimes are a little counterintuitive, maybe about post-harvest washing, those kind of things where I definitely have to provide some more context. But for the most part, GAP concepts are pretty straightforward, just keeping it clean, right? But the records themselves take some time to set up. So I'm happy to help growers do that. Some photos of us visiting with some farms that are selling to Minneapolis Public Schools. So I'm going to talk real briefly about the model that we've set up with them, just as kind of a model that anybody could take and modify as needed. But basically, Minneapolis Public Schools does not require a GAP audit, but they do want some sort of food safety verification. Their processor, Russ Davis Wholesale, does generally require a GAP audit. If you were to knock on the door, a farmer off the street, and said, "I'd like to sell you carrots," they would say, "You need a GAP audit on those carrots." A GAP audit is on the product, not on the farm. But through Minneapolis Public Schools, they've kind of developed a system whereby Russ Davis says, okay, you can do a farm visit. You can get a written food safety plan, and we will have a site assessment form for each farm, and we will review the bacterial testing of their well water. And then that will kind of be in lieu of a GAP audit. Now, this is, I understand, a little unique. I mean, not every large wholesaler is basically going to take this in lieu of visit, and frankly, not every educator in my role might be able to do those kind of one-on-one visits. I feel like it's a win-win because I'm getting to be connected with the growers, like David said, it's absolutely critical to get out there and see the real what is happening in the field. So many things I see, people aren't going to think to email me a question about using their sanitizer. But when I'm out there, I learn so much, and I'm able to make connections with them. So these visits are really useful. And then the growers, I'm happy to say, sometimes grumble about it. To be honest, it's one more thing in their day. I mean, it's not that they're mean or crabby or anything, but heck, they got a lot to think about. So an hour site visit with me is maybe not on the top of their list of things to do. However, we keep it really friendly. We actually specifically don't use clipboards, even though sometimes I wish I would. We usually keep notes on our phones. And Kate, my representative from Minneapolis Public Schools, takes notes, and I mainly do the talking. So we keep it real friendly. I say, tell me about what you do for food safety. And I just kind of have it in my head, but I could be using a sheet. Tell me about your hand washing. Tell me about when you're harvesting. And I'll tell you some of those questions that we ask here, but I just wanted to show a few pictures. You can see one of the monk farms at the bottom, a nice setup. But it is open air. He has a covered, but it's open air, which is totally fine. That would pass a gap audit. His totes were up on crates. He has hand washing, he has soap, he has paper towels, he has, flowing water, and he discards that water away from the vegetables when he's done. If you haven't been on a monk farm, you might think it looks a little rough, but it isn't. He manages the risks. He identifies those risks and manages them. Would it be a little bit better if it was an enclosed pack shed? Sure, but it's not at all required by a gap audit or the FSMA rule. So my mantra is do the best with what you have. And they do not need to be a cash outlay. Sometimes it's definitely some time to improve those systems. So just to be clear, GAPs are these voluntary science-based practices, kind of a lens that you might look at your farming practices through. And we're talking about microbiological hazards. We're not talking about pesticides. We're not talking about chemicals. And we're generally not talking about physical contaminants like glass. But a gap audit does have a few questions about, like, do you have shatterproof bulbs, for example, in your pack shed? Because that's a pain to clean up a shattered bulb in your pack shed. So yeah, we're talking about those parasites and bacteria and viruses, and a little parasites as well. And these come from fecal contamination from humans and animals. So we're not talking about dirt. I really like to differentiate. There's nothing that says, soil is inherently bad or anything. We're really talking about the fecal contamination within that soil. I was chatting a little bit with Kazua about their gap audit. And I really would like to say that I think that a gap audit, or at least following good agricultural practices, really can help level that playing field if a farmer is interested and able to sell at a level that makes financial sense to get that gap audit. So I think the first question is, and my next slide will talk about how much a gap audit costs, but assuming you're going to spend $800 the first year, maybe, or $1,000, maybe it's a little bit less in subsequent years because your system is figured out. It's cold hard math. It's not like a feel good, hey, I'm going to get a gap audit because it, feels nice or something. Do the practices, do everything up to the gap audit, because you don't want to get anyone sick and get your farm put out of business. And because it can really improve kind of efficiency, it really helps. It goes hand in hand with organic certification and with kind of a systems level thinking on your farm. Workers who have farms that have kind of a food safety system often say, I really like this. Yeah, some of the records are one more added thing, although we kind of integrate them into the things that we're already doing. And it can make the farm just a nicer place to be. There's a system at the end of the day. We clean and sanitize our tools and we put them away. So in the morning, ideally, they're there waiting for me. So those semi-small things really add up. If the rain jackets are always filthy because it's no one's job to clean them, that's kind of a pain. So there are many sort of added benefits, and it also really just goes hand in hand with good quality food. So your post-harvest handling is going to be improved. Perhaps the use of the sanitizer and wash water can potentially improve the shelf life of your product. So it just kind of goes hand in hand with the goals of a farm anyways. But if a farm does want to sell, if they're able to sell at that kind of wholesale level, that does require a gap audit. If they're really good at growing winter squash and they're selling to a wholesaler or a food hub that requires that gap audit, then I think we have to help them get that gap audit. I try not to just blankly, kind of always say a gap audit is beyond everyone's ability, or it's too complicated, or it's too hard. If it works financially and they want to sell to that market, I think it's our job to help them get that. And you as Extension or a food hub can help them do that. So to be clear, the food service or the food hub does not have to require a gap audit by any means, but they can. The Big River and the Good Acre do not require a gap audit. Either does Minneapolis Schools, which is pretty typical because we don't have that many farms in Minnesota that have a gap audit. If they put that as a requirement, they would only have the larger, Anglo growers who are already, frankly, pretty maxed. Their markets are pretty taken care of. I would say that would not be in line with the values of those food hubs. So they don't ask for a gap audit, but they can require or ask for food safety practices. And that's the kind of thing that I've done with Minneapolis Public Schools and that kind of in lieu of system. So that gap audit is that independent review that the farmer pays for. It's important to remember. So one thing, if you're writing grants, you could put in grants to cover the cost of that audit for a farm. I would definitely say your plan for sustainability for that. If you were writing that into a grant, I would not just say we plan to cover it, because then the reviewers are going to say, what about when this grant goes away? So it's just something to keep in mind, but it is something that you could put in, or maybe there's a line item in some sort of legislation for specialty crops. For example, in Minnesota, 75% of the cost of that gap audit, so let's say it's $800 a year, 75% of that for the first 3 years, the farmer can get reimbursed back to them by just filling out a quick form. That's really helpful for a newer farmer getting a gap audit. So they just have it for 3 years because they expect the farm after that to have it as a cost of doing business. So it generally, I say here that it is State Department of Ag auditor, but that it really could be any auditors. There's private firms. There's people who it is their only job to go to different states and conduct gap audits. They have to be certified as an auditor. So I am not an auditor, I'm an educator. So I could not go out and conduct a gap audit. I can do, and the auditors really like it, if I do a visit first, make sure everything's good, basically a practice run that really makes it run smoothly on the day of the audit. Because the farmer is paying by the hour. So the auditor wants it to go smoothly. They are not trying to milk the farmers by any means. Funny note, not funny, but the USDA actually loses money on these gap audits. It costs them a lot of money to offer these. So the USDA thinks of it as a service that they're offering to farmers that the farmers pay for to confer market access to some markets. So again, only about 15 vegetable farms in Minnesota have a gap audit. There's a bunch more potato and apple, but it's only a handful. So I really try to make that message clear when I talk to my buyers. And I say, hey, you do not have to require a gap audit. If you do, you will necessarily be narrowing that pool.
Hey, Annalisa. Sorry to interrupt, but I just confirmed with Laura, and she said it was not a gap audit. And I thought it was FSMA, but so you were correct. It's been a few years, but the reason why I was confused is because we still train our farm. So we still do all the things because we have had gap audits in the past, and we still do all of our things as if we're going to get a gap audit because we want our farmers to get used to it if that is something that they want to do in the future. And I asked Laura, why haven't we been doing it? And she said cost is the main thing, and then also because it's not required. So I'm wondering, my question is, how come these organizations who are like the retailers, how come they're not really requiring it if it is something that's really important to prevent like diseases? Because we do have disease management stations at the farm. We have boot cleaners. You have to rinse your shoes before you walk into any of our cooler spaces, even in the pack shed, where you're coming from the field. Our system at the farm is very comprehensive, and then we do tool cleaning, tool washing. We even have a cleaning station for your car for aftermarket. So we are like really kind of strict when it comes to kind of those things for practices for farmers, but then we don't. And then I love the idea of like farming, like adding that into the budget, because that's something we ask farmers every year. Even last year is to ask them if they want to do a gap audit, and we can help set them up for it. So Laura said that we haven't done it in a while, but we do still practice those different things just in case it's something that we want to demonstrate for our farmers. So sorry, I'm really sorry for confusing. And
I kind of thought that was the case because I know I've been working with Big River for a long time, and I knew that you guys had a gap audit in the past. And this is actually really typical. People get a gap audit, and then the markets stop the markets that they want to sell to don't require it. Why would you spend money on something that you don't have to do for the market? So it's just our local food industry is so CSA and farmers market focused. There are just, in my opinion, or direct to, you know, and David Wayne here too, direct to co-ops, to retail. They do not require a gap audit except for like a larger grocery chain, but there's so few growers that sell into those larger markets. There's just really a handful, and the handful that do have a gap audit. So I guess I would say my only goal is to help growers who might see a large grocery chain or a distributor as a market that they want to enter and that makes financial sense to them. I want to help them get a gap audit so they can enter that market. But it sounds like Big River doesn't need to. So you guys are doing, I think in my mind, all the things. You're doing the good practices. Your records are good. So if you had to get a gap audit, it would be a piece of cake.
Great, thanks.
So I know that the focus has been on a lot on vegetable growers, but what about if you have a livestock operation that wants GAP certification and maybe they're doing value-added products as well, like, I don't know, goat cheese?
Yep. So
there are beginning farmers, especially veterans, that would be interested in those kind of things.
Yep. So this is specifically for fresh produce. The GAP program through USDA only encompasses the production of fresh produce. Your meat and your dairy would fall under your state's licensing. So that would be, you know, you'd have to follow the licensing requirements in terms of having a facility that meets the requirements for production and packaging of cheese. But that's not generally a national scope. It's not this. But to be clear, there are many produce farms that I work with that also have livestock operations. So they're kind of a mixed facility, but the meat side would be different, and it would have to be processed in a facility that was USDA inspected. Okay, so I'll keep on going. So I talked a little bit about this model with Minneapolis schools, but I'll just spell it out again because I think it's kind of interesting. And if you happen to have the kind of components, if you have somebody who's able and interested in providing that education, doing that site visit, it could be extension folks. You know, food safety doesn't need to be their only job. It can be something that they, you know, I'd be happy to send along kind of some of the major professional development trainings. For example, you could become a FSMA trainer, attend that Train the Trainer. That's a kind of in-depth 3.5-day training all about on-farm food safety. Also the FSMA rule, but a lot about just GAPs. So for example, you can train people up like that. They can take the National GAPS program, which is out of Cornell University, take that online training. There's a couple of different ways that you can kind of improve your skill set around food safety. Then that person, whoever it might be, might do this site visit. So that would be, we have a written conversation guide that I sent to Sarah, but it basically just asking those questions and then following up, sending people ideas if they have questions. Some basic records are good. When we do the visit for MPS, we do not require any records outside of that well water testing. Now, I do make it clear that it's a pretty light ask that we're asking of them if in terms of records in a real GAP audit. So if they had a real GAP audit, you would definitely need to show records relating to cleaning and sanitizing, filling your hand washing stand, employee training, and you also have to have those standard operating procedures. Like you have to have a procedure that says how you clean and sanitize your totes and your tools and equipment. So that might be something that a lot of farms have, but they don't have it documented. So it's just in the winter, writing out what your SOP is for that, printing it out and having it as a part of your log. So nothing in it is like extremely difficult, but it's definitely time consuming. And I will say it does not have to be in English. So if the primary language of the folks on the farm is something other than English, then it should be in that language. On the day of the audit, then you would have to have somebody who is able to speak English to the auditor if the auditor only spoke English. But you could describe what those records are. My understanding is in Minnesota, at least, that auditor can say, oh, okay, I understand, and you could describe what those, what the records are. And they can often just kind of tell. But the well water is important. That's just kind of that's often a good agricultural practice. It's about $35. They need to test their well water annually for the presence of generic E. coli is a best practice. And that should come back as no detectable. So now I will take a little bit of time here and just do a really quick overview of some of these good agricultural practices. Now, this might be review for some of you, I'm not sure, but it applies to all scales of farms. This is not just for big farms. I work with tons of urban farms. Sorry if my computer is being loud, the fan just turned on. So I will do this real quick, and this has some nice pictures too. So hand washing and hygiene, like David said, is one of the kind of key things that we ask for right away. And it really is an indication that they take food safety seriously if there's good hand washing. And I'm happy to say, I think it might be COVID, but hand washing is very common, very prevalent on farms. Now, making sure that those tanks are filled with water is different, but they can have any different systems. You can order a stand on Amazon. You can have it fully plumbed. It cannot be plumbed, whatever, as long as there's running water, can't be a bucket. There's running water in this model here. You see the water coming down. You have a spigot, so it's continuous flow. It's not like an igloo that you have to press because that doesn't work very well because then you got one hand. There's soap and there's paper towel. So I say, where are the hand washing facilities? This italicized things are a question I might ask when I'm on the farm. Where's the bathroom that the workers use? Is it in the house? No problem. Technically, as per a GAP audit, if that bathroom is the worker's bathroom, you do need to have single-use paper towels in there as well. If you're not getting a GAP audit, do what you want to do. Is there a policy on sick workers? Do you just have it documented and do your train your workers? Don't come to work if you're sick with GI issues. If you have vomiting and diarrhea, we do not want you on the farm. It is way too high of a risk. That is actually one of the most important things research shows is literally just excluding sick workers. So this is what I mean when gaps don't necessarily cost money, it's having a policy. But I will say that in reality can cost money. I'm well aware that if you are the only worker on your farm and you are sick, you're out a day's work. So I guess I should not say it doesn't cost money. It's not a cash outlay. It's a potential loss in revenue, however, I completely recognize. But excluding sick workers is one of the most important things they can do to reduce the chances of foodborne illness. This is on the back of a pickup truck here. Does not need to be fancy. And this is nice because it goes out to the field. So when you've got your hands in some raccoon poop or you sneeze, are you really going to walk back a couple miles? You're not. So having it on the back of your pickup truck is going to be really important in that scenario. We have some designs on how to build the hand washing stand. We actually made a short video, filmed it at the Good Acre as well, how to make this stand. This is one idea. People do not have to, do this exactly, but it's nice because that dish pan drawer has paper towels in it. They pull it out and then it's somewhat protected from the rain. But then I've heard people say, oh, we totally have changed that. And I'm like, great, you guys are the engineers. You can totally do it better. But have a place to catch the paper towel as well. And then that water, just don't put it on the vegetables. In most places, although Wisconsin, I've heard water like that needs to go down a septic, which seems like crazy overkill to me because this is not black water coming out of a sewer. This is just has a little bit of soap in it. As a good agricultural practice, putting it on some lawn or a fruit tree is just fine. I will say check with your local ordinances to make sure you're not breaking anything there. So water is really important, especially in a year like this in Minnesota, really strong drought. But do think about water as something that could both introduce contaminants and also potentially spread it around the farm. So we want to make sure that for post-harvest uses, that water is potable. We're not using surface water. We're not using water that comes back with any detectable E. coli, total coliforms from our well water tests. For irrigation, technically you can use surface water. That gets kind of technical, so I won't go there. But I would ask a farmer, where's your water coming from? Just real conversationally. If they say, oh, we've got a well, we test it. Okay, great. There's a couple of other things I could ask about that, but generally that's all I look for. And I look for that documented test that came back. This is a picture of surface water. Surface water can be dangerous. So this would be water that technically might be able to be used for irrigation. Certainly not for post-harvest uses. In Minnesota, we actually don't use that much surface water. It's here or there. but it's not that common. We have a lot of well water, although this year our wells are doing tough because it's so dry. So compost and soil amendments, to be clear, absolutely allowed to use manure and animal-based compost in for the production of fresh fruits and vegetables with a GAP audit and under FSMA. So there's nothing that disallows that at all. It just needs to not present a source of contamination for the vegetables. So when we're washing our hands, we're thinking about minuscule, tiny microbiological amounts of fecal manure, or human or animal. This is piles of it. So it has the potential to introduce a lot of risk. The best practice, so I would say, do you guys use any animal-based soil amendments? If they say yes, I say, oh, okay, where do you store it and when do you apply it? The best practice, in accordance with the NOP guidelines, FSMA does not currently have a standard for the application, the use of these biological soil amendments that come from animals. NOP says apply at least 90 or 120 days before you harvest that product. So 120 days if that product is actually in contact with the soil, like a melon. 90 days if it is off the soil, like a tomato. So that is a best practice, and that's because that compost really can contain high amounts of contamination. If you apply a fully treated product, like something that you purchase from a supplier that has gone through the scientifically validated process, you do not need to wait. So that 90 or 120 days is if it's considered raw, which sitting in a pile for a year is still considered raw. So that one gets a little bit technical, but still pretty straightforward. So this is why we have to be careful. There's a pile of manure. It's pretty darn close to those, whatever they are, potentially lettuce fields, for example. So you get a heavy rain, if depending on the topography there, that's running right into the lettuce, right? Which I might eat tomorrow, my kids might eat tomorrow. And the other important thing to remember and know is that you cannot wash off all contamination. The way that the products are, especially lettuce, something with lots of bumpy surfaces, it can potentially get stuck on there, and washing will not eliminate it, depending on how high the levels are initially, especially. I'm kind of cruising here. We'll have time for Q&A if there are some. So safe harvest, I say, just walk me through your harvest practice. Like, so you're picking these tomatoes, where do they go into? Like, what's your first step? And I hope they say, well, we wash our hands before we go out to the field. And then where do you pick into? Often they say, I just put it in these totes. Okay, where are the totes? Are they on the ground, or are they on some sort of a flipped over bin or a cart? It's best if they can be off the ground. The product might be pretty darn clean to start with. It's often growing out of, yes, it's growing in the soil, but it's often growing off the soil. So it's pretty clean, depending on, rain and wind and everything. But I've seen, people picking stuff up and putting it on the ground before they harvest it, or before they put it in a bin. And it's like, that's not a great idea. So we kind of talk through that harvest practice and talk about where the totes are stored. If they're stored outside, that's okay. They will need to wash and clean and probably sanitize then as a best practice before they used those totes, because animals and things could have run over those totes. So it's a lot about storage of the totes and boxes. And then one of the most important things you can do is just train your workers not to harvest things with visible bird poop, for example, because birds love those bean and tomato trellises. But obviously bird poop is a potential source of salmonella. So your containers here, this is a nice, cute container that sometimes I see at farmers markets, and it's not great. This is something that's very cutesy. You can't clean and you can't sanitize that. So think about your farm is really an extension of the kitchen. You're picking into things that you can clean and sanitize. They don't have bumps and cracks and surfaces where those microbes can hide. Microbes are very, very small, so they can hide in there well. So quickly on animals, obviously lots of places have animals, totally fine. If you have pets, you've got to keep them out of the growing area. Don't invite them into the pack shed or the high tunnels or the fields, and you have to train them to stay out of there. I'm not saying they can't ever wander through by accident, but your goal has to be to keep them out. tell folks to leave pets at home if they're coming out for a field day or something. And fencing for wildlife obviously is a really best practice, just because we don't want to lose the products to nibbling anyways. Of course, we can not eliminate the presence of wildlife in the field. So really the goal is to just do our best. Traps, deterrents, all these kind of things. There's a lot of different things that farmers try to do because they don't want the wildlife in there either. The only thing you can really do is look for the signs of contamination before you harvest, and don't harvest stuff that has direct contamination on it. Keep the pets out, have the visitors keep their pets at home. They think that Fido is well trained, but Fido maybe never has been in a farm, and the minute Fido gets there, he's running to that spinach and going pee and leaving the farmer with a mess to clean up, which is not great. So here is some deterrents. There's all kinds of things people use, flashing things. There's no right answer, really, whatever works with you. And you got to move them, you got to change them. You know, animals are pretty darn smart. Floppy guy, I've actually talked to a couple of people who use the floppy guy. Obviously you have to have power. This would be for like high value crops, like some fruit. Likely, I think that was definitely some berry crops. Fencing is your best deterrent and probably your only deterrent for deers. So we have pretty high deer pressure here. So fencing, I help farms get access to those kind of things. So quick pop quiz here. You can chat it or say it. So what do we see here that's maybe not great? So this is in a high tunnel. Yes, David says, is that a litter box? That is a litter box. So farmers aren't dumb. She put that litter box in there for a reason. And because we're running short on time, I will tell you, and I think you probably already know, that she has the litter box because she had not only a mouse problem, but a rat problem. Rats, right? So she had these big rats from a nearby poultry farm, Turkey, I think. They were doing damage to her crops and she did not want them. So she thought she's going to bring the cat box in to bring the cat in. But feet away on the ground, she was growing a bunch of lettuce for a large, she sold to a ton of restaurants and things, I will say. So it's a tough conversation. So this is why I really encourage whoever's doing this assistance with the farm to really have done their due diligence and training themselves. This isn't just maybe a conversation that every last person could have, because somebody might look at that and say, good idea, keeps the mice at bay, right? The answer is that those cats carry toxoplasma, and that's a parasite that can be very dangerous, especially to pregnant women and children. So the risks here, it's often you're weighing your risks and your benefits. The risks outweigh the benefits. So having a farm cat is fine, having your barn cat is fine, but don't invite it in. Put that litter box outside, put it in your barn where you have your storage of your, other machinery and things. That's just fine. But your food, try to keep the food production and handling places as kind of as sacred as you can. Don't have a bunch of non-food related things, and don't allow or encourage animals to be in there. So there's a lot of kind of nuanced conversations, I would say. So finally, the packing area, sanitation. Like I said, the packing areas can be open. They can be completely open without even a pop-up. That's really tough, though. That's really not a best practice. I've seen that a few times this summer. And I really encourage growers to at least buy a pop-up tent. It's not that much money, because first of all, for your workers, it's darn hot. You don't want to be packing under the sun. And for the post-harvest quality, you've got to cool down that produce. And if you are packing in the sun, it's just not great. Under a tree is not great because the birds, obviously. So really just get a pop-up. You can have good food safety under a pop-up, or then a lean-to kind of open air like we saw, or finally a fully enclosed pack shed is obviously just fine too. But really I say, how do you manage the risks given the system that you have? How do you clean and sanitize your totes? And then where do you store them? So the idea with equipment is that it can build up that biofilm, that slime. So think about the inside of your fish bowl or your dog food bowl, your dog water bowl. It gets slimy, right? That's biofilm. And that's a secretion from those microorganisms that they secrete to protect themselves. And if you let that build up, it will have microorganisms more get stuck in there. It's like a web of stuff. So they will get stuck in there, and some of those might be pathogenic that can sicken people. So really it's like brushing your teeth, just get at those biofilms. And you know, there is no right answer about how often. A gap audit will say, how often do you say you will wash them? And then show me proof that you did it. There is no right answer. The typical answer is your totes are cleaned a few times a season. You got a lot of totes, a couple times a season for a full scrub down. Now, if they're stored outside, a gap auditor is going to tell you you'd have to do it more frequently because stuff could run over them. If you have an enclosed pack shed or really anywhere, do you have good drainage? Is water not building up? That's also really important. I see quite a bit of standing water, and listeria especially can breed in there. You don't want a lot of pests. Make sure that you have some mouse traps if it's an enclosed building. If it's an open air, I don't see the point of having pest control necessarily, but don't like store seeds and things right next to where your boxes are. You're going to be inviting the mice in. And then finally, washing. So it is not at all required to wash all produce. And this is probably one of the more kind of questions that I get a lot of, and kind of a complicated answer, because some product definitely needs to be cooled down right away, right? And some of it is hydrocooled. That broccoli, he's hydrocooling. Some people pack into ice. It's good for the post-harvest quality of that product. The best idea is to use some sort of a sanitizer in that wash water, because it doesn't clean the produce, but it reduces the potential that the water itself is going to spread contamination. So if there was some bird poop you didn't see on some of that broccoli and you put it in that water, you've just kind of made a big soup of potentially bird poop water. So putting a sanitizer in there really reduces those microorganism levels and makes that kind of bulk watching scenario safer. There are some things that just should never be washed. We don't wash tomatoes around here. I know they do in some states. Fresh herbs, berries, never washed. Think about it. Does it need to be washed? I always say, ask your buyer. Definitely have a clear conversation. Do you want me to wash it? And the buyer might say, oh no, we're going to wash it. You know, you really don't need to. Now, some restaurants unfortunately want stuff coming in really clean. But I guess I would push back a little bit as much as you can as the farmer and say, you know what, we're just in an on-farm situation. I'll get rid of the bulk field soil. Of course, you're not going to be getting, you know, caked on roots with soil, but everybody needs to wash the produce again once it comes off our farm, because we just did kind of a farm wash, but we used potable water, we washed our hands, and we used the sanitizer in that wash water. That's kind of all you can do there. You can use a spray table. That really is a great way to reduce risk for products that can handle it. Of course, the sturdier products, you spray on that spray table. This is a great design coming out of the Good Acre. And then for things like leafy greens, of course, you would do in a bulk tank. So you see there, they did a fresh water rinse, and then they did another fresh water rinse, and then they used sanitizer. So those leaves are coming out really clean, and then they're drying it some way and then packaging it. So changing that water frequently is another best practice. Cleaning and sanitizing those tools, sometimes we forget that it's actually a multi-step process, making sure to get rid of, you know, you've got a dirty tote, clean it down, scrub it with some soap, spray it down again with water, and then spray it with that sanitizer and let it air dry. A sanitizer that is very low cost, 2 teaspoons of bleach and about a gallon of water will get you that sanitizer for food contact surfaces. You need to replace that every few weeks. You can also, that would not be approved, my understanding, in most organic systems. There are products that are based on peroxyacetic acid, like a Sanidate. That would be something that a lot of organic producers use. So some of my take-home messages here are just to learn enough about food safety, have someone from an organization or lean on extension to provide that education to growers to answer those questions, helping growers really identify those couple of key actions. I often leave a farm visit with 2 to 3 take-homes for a grower. That's it. You know, if they don't ever wash their totes on a scheduled basis, I say come up with a schedule for that. If they don't have any hand washing, I say do that. You know, so there's really just often definitely no more than 3 kind of action items for them. And really focusing on the things that make the biggest impact in risk reduction. Hand washing, worker training, don't work when you're sick, keep your totes and things generally clean, go a long way. You don't need to get bogged down in the details of some of the smaller items. and just staying positive. I really do see food safety as my goal is to make it something that doesn't ever prevent a local food connection from happening, so to speak. If it's farm to school, if it's farm to food hub, whatever. And then just some ideas about from what food hubs might offer. So that farmer assistance that I mentioned, I think I've already said, really tying it to those larger goals, trying not to make it scary or like, oh, this is this thing this government makes us do. It's like, oh, it's just a part of having a well-operating, kind of well-oiled machine for our farm, and kind of empowering farms to have that as something to make improvements over the years. Opening markets if they did get a gap audit, and then finally just, I never lead with liability because I don't like to come at it with a stick approach, but liability is real. And if you got someone sick or were even implicated in an outbreak, having your basic records is going to be, lawyers tell me, the only thing that can protect you. You can be doing the best things in the world. If you don't have some of those records to show that you did it, you're not going to be able to protect yourself as well. That is it from me. I will stop sharing so we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Annalisa. I love that presentation. I think it's the 4th time that I've seen it. And I'm not even farming anymore, and I still enjoy it. So does anybody want to jump in with questions? If everybody wants to turn on their cameras so we can see each other. And I think we'll do questions till about 2 o'clock. Unless there are a lot more than that. Anybody just wants to jump in.
I can answer the worm casting. So absolutely fine to use those worm castings. I think they're pretty expensive unless I'm mistaken. So it's a potential source of fertility. It would not be considered a validated scientific process, like the worm itself. If you fed in a bunch of, if there was contamination in the initial feedstock for the worm ate it and then pooped it out, the research shows that contamination can go through the worm and can be in its in its poop too. So if you buy the stuff from a source like a store that has it listed as went through a scientifically validated treatment, you're good. You don't need to wait at all. You don't need to use that 90 or 120 days. If it's somebody who did it in their backyard and they said, I don't know about the feedstock, I think I gave it some manure and then it's good to go, to err on the safe side, would apply it like in the fall so that if there was contamination, it would have time to die.
I have a quick question. What do you think the estimated cost for a beginning grower to implement the practices, like, even like at the very, very bare minimum, just to cover? I know every farm is going to be different. If they have like a pond on site, then they'd have to fence that off, and that's an expense that may be unique to the farm, that pond. But like, can you itemize the cost of the different practices that have to be implemented so that you could like pitch it to a grower and say, okay, this is about what it's going to cost you if you did it yourself, and just put the least amount of money into it?
The water test is a hard and fast cost. So that's something that's pretty easy to check off. In terms of the actual lab cost, it's going to be like $25 to $40. So that's that annual fee. The other bigger costs are going to be anything in that post-harvest area. So again, totally depends on what their current situation is. But let's say they had nothing. If it was an urban farm, or if it was just a new farmer and they had nothing but land, nowhere to wash or store their vegetables, I guess I would argue that's not a food safety cost. That's just the cost of their farm to have a place to pack the vegetables and then cool it. So I guess it, but like the sanitizer itself can be a couple $100s a year, some spray bottles, so all of those post-harvest things might be $300 to $400. But by far, I would say the biggest thing would be the time associated with thinking through the system. So not that cash outlay, but in the winter, sitting down and saying, how is our pack shed going to be laid out, or whatever, our post-harvest area? How is it going to be laid out? Let's draw a system for that. Let's write an SOP about how often we're going to clean. Like that's a time thing. David or Kazuo, do you have anything to add there?
You know, I was just going to say that, I mean, we work with a lot of farmers who don't have any water at all on site. And so they're washing at home, which brings a whole nother set of challenges. You know, I mean, that's a low cost option, is to go that way, especially if you're on city water. At least you have some of those bases covered because you know the quality of the water. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I talked about how much time I spend visiting farms and stuff. I don't do that. I don't do follow-up visits to people's houses where they wash produce in their driveway, you know, because that's just, you know, that's just too much time. So, but it is a weak point in all that. Is like, you can't, if they don't have water, you can't see the whole process on the farm.
I would say, Michelle, that when I was working at Frogtown Farm, one thing that was challenging for us, because we leased land from Wilder, which is still part of the St. Paul City area, we didn't have a place to wash our produce. We couldn't even we weren't even allowed to build our pack shed there because we're just leasing land. So what we did was the Good Acre, we contracted with them, and then we would bring our produce there, and we would use their kitchen to wash our produce. And it's a lot of work doing that, but then it was worth it at the end of the day, because then you knew that you had a safe place to be able to use clean water. And then the Good Acre also provided space for us to store and cool our food. So just really, if that farmer cannot absolutely have that system in place the first 1 to 3 years of their farming life, like making sure that they can identify other resources that might be available in the area, that they can share those resources with too, because I think that's also important to be able to identify as educators, like going in to serve these farmers, not expecting them to identify all these resources themselves, because it's already overwhelming trying to start a business in this way. But really, as educators, farmers are dependent on us because we're supposed to come with resources and knowledge. So making sure that you do your homework and looking into these resources that might already exist, so that you can connect farmers with these different groups of platforms.
I would say if you are able to write grants, if you're in the position of writing grants, I have definitely in the last year switched much more toward purchasing things instead of just people, instead of more fact sheets, instead of like another description. Sometimes posters in simple English or in the language of a place is okay. But I see a lot of my colleagues in other states, like it's easy to check a box on a grant and like translate some huge thing. And it's like Kazuo said, oh my gosh, do the people want it translated into, are they able to read that language? First question. And maybe the answer is yes for some specific documents, but it might be no. I think putting money, you know, if you can work your grant magic and justify it to say, we are going to spend $2,000 on each farm to help them improve their post-harvest equipment. Because I really think we need to move away from just saying, here's what you should do. You know, that's a part of it, and you know, not in a finger wagging way, but in a, hey, this is what science tells us. Here's some best practices, and here's the way other farmers have done it, and like having farmers teach that part themselves, and then saying, and as a part of this grant that I'm managing, and that's like the value that perhaps an organization can bring, is all the administration that comes with those grants, which we know can be a lot, is purchasing those $2,000. I'm going to buy you this spray table. I'm going to buy you sanitizing tools and equipment. Of course, then there has to be like an educational component to that. I think most funders would not be thrilled with just buying money for a private business, which that farm is. But if you said, you know, we're going to, like David and I are going to work together to make a fact sheet on a very simple description of a post-harvest kit, so to speak, for a small farm that might be washing vegetables in their driveway. So instead of saying like, wow, washing vegetables in your driveway, that sounds crazy. It's like, okay, this is the reality because there's no water on the farm. What are they supposed to do? Thinking through the systems as they are and suggesting ways to improve them. And then as possible, actually providing the purchasing of the equipment, which we know can't be for everybody. And then that may be bringing up issues of equity where some growers are going to say, I want that, you know, sort of a thing. But at least where possible, bringing in the resources to buy the things, I think would be good. So when we come up with that kind of kit, which I think we're going to have to do in the next couple of months, we'd be happy to pass that on. And I believe that post-harvest kit's probably going to come out at about $1,000, and that will list out those products like the spray table, the sanitizer, the tools, the scrub brushes, those.
I was just going to add on quick to Annalise's, having those kinds of things available for people is also a great way to get people to come to education things you want people to come to. If you're either going to give away one of those, or you're going to give everybody gets one, or farmers like to get free stuff. So it's a good plan.
I was going to add, I had two questions. First, I was wondering, Annalisa, you mentioned the number of GAP certified farms in Minnesota, and wondering if that information is available somewhere in a database. Like, I thought that number, I was really interested in like how low that number was, and was imagining probably that it might be pretty similar here in Ohio. Would love to like have that information.
Yep,
We
it's
were
absolutely.
talking with buyers too. Yeah.
Yep, I will send you that link. It's a USDA site, so it's a little, looks like 2000, you know, or something. It's kind of old school. But basically they have a report, you generate a report on the GAP page, on the national GAP page. And then you pick your state, and then it generates the report for that state. So I will say it includes like facilities. So the Good Acre has a good handling practices audit on their facility. They're listed on there. So that's not a farm, you know, so it's, you have to kind of weed through them. And lots of potato and apples around here, but the potato they're going offsite. They're going to McDonald's fries and being sold to Idaho, you know, so it doesn't do us much good. So I think that is a really important number to have on hand, so that buyers don't just kind of across the board say, well, of course I would want a GAP audit. Why wouldn't I?
Thank you. Yeah. The other thing or maybe this is more like a comment, but one of the other things that I think is, I hear a lot from GAP is like this assumption about like maintaining a chain of like cold refrigeration throughout, which is not not a requirement within GAP necessarily, but is more customer driven. Is that correct?
Definitely customer driven. And if you consistently have products that rots right away, you will lose that customer. But it is not a hard and fast requirement. I'm going back. So the good thing about a GAP audit is all that checklist is 100% available to you ahead of time. So there are no.
Yeah, I have.
So one of the questions in the patch set is, do you have a way to cool product? If you say no, then I believe the auditor's next question would be, what is that product? And if you can justify, if you can say, you know, I get it to my buyer really quickly, and therefore it doesn't become a food safety issue, they'll say, okay, you'll get the points for that. It's also point-based. So you can choose which points to lose and still pass it. I think there is a question on it though, but it's like just one question. It's like a 5-point question, so you can lose those. There are many GAP audited farms that have super simple operations. They field pack their peppers, they don't cool them, they send them right to market. Like the simpler, the kind of easier in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I had a question, and I guess this one's more to David and Kazua. I was just thinking about the producers that participate in the food hub, and then also the buyers too. How do they find the food hub? Are they being actively recruited? Do they find you? Or for the incubator farm, are they being actively recruited, Kazua, or did they find you? Like, how do we, if we were to look in Ohio at our food hubs, what are the methods to grow food hubs?
Well, for our program, for sure, I think it has been because we've been doing it for a while. And so our program is also listed on the U of M website, and also Minnesota Department of Agriculture website. And also we are in collaboration and partnership with like a lot of different agricultural organizations. So we cross-share each other's information. And so we get a lot of people who reach out to us, especially when it comes to culturally specific produce, because we have so many different like diverse groups of farmers. And so like May Lee, she grows like these chicken herbs that I don't know anybody else who really grows organic chicken herbs. And so we specialize in organic produce too. So there's like a lot of reasons why people would find us. And also because we merged with the Food Group of Minnesota, which is a food bank. So that's why it makes our program even more stronger, I think, because we have a food bank that can share out the information about what our farmers are doing. And then also because it is a food bank, it's able to buy produce from our farmers and then send it out to our agency partners. And then they hear about our farms and our program and things like that too. So it's sharing, it's networking, but also we've been doing this for a while. And so our name is just kind of well known in that way.
Yeah, and I would say that's similar for us, that we have been doing that long enough that we have a pretty good network of farmers, and always new farmers interested in selling to us. So there's always people contacting us that we can put on a waiting list or know, like, or, sometimes you get someone new contacting you who might have something that your current farmers don't have. So we can, work them in right away. So yeah, I think for us, building relationships with the communities that we're serving has done the most, and also doing what we say we're going to do, really builds a lot of trust with the communities to just say, we're going to pay farmers quick, we're going to pay them on time, they're going to get paid what we said we were going to pay them. I mean, just being honest and straightforward with people and treating them with respect, and then word gets out that like, hey, that these guys are okay. If you have extra stuff, you should contact them. I mean, that's makes a big difference.
I would like to add one thing personally, in terms of that food safety plan, and the ease of putting one together. When I sold to the Minneapolis Public Schools, Annalisa and Kate came out to my farm. They looked at my food safety plan and they asked all those questions. And it just as she said, it was empowering, because it was like, oh, this is what I'm already doing. And it's now more systematized. And it was just kind of, and that was, I think, in my 7th year of farming. So I didn't do it right away because, and I wish I would have, but I didn't until the market required, even just a food safety plan. But it was not as scary and big as it seemed like it was going to be. And having that food safety plan in place made me feel more confident, just even in taking my product to market, to be honest, to farmers market. So that's just a little personal plug for food safety and food safety plans. If there are no other questions for David, Kazua, and Annalisa, I would just like to thank them so much for their time this afternoon. This has been great.